Well, this is the Lent season. Lent comes from the Latin word for 40, and it's observed for 40 days before Good Friday. So it begins with Ash Wednesday, and it continues on for 40 days, and it heads on up to Easter. And so for thousands of years in church history, there's been this kind of understanding that the church has a heartbeat. It has a pulse. The church calendar ebbs and flows through different periods of the year, and we need that. We need that so that our year isn't just kind of flat and stagnant and monotonous. So each of us, we all need periods of celebration and then periods of reflection and periods of anticipation, periods of coming together and periods of going away. And so Lent is basically the anticipation of resurrection. It's the road that leads to Easter. And so as this season hits us, we're going to prepare and take 2 weeks out of our years to learn about the lament. Before we get to celebration, we want to explore some of those other emotions. And this morning, we're going to look at the Book of Lamentations. So why the Book of Lamentations? You might think, well, I don't really know much about that book. Why are we studying this? Well, the season of Lent is a season of penitence. Regret for wrongdoing, we might say compunction, contrition, remorse. It's the act of reflection. It's the inward journey. At one time in his ministry, Jesus said, "All who want to come after me must say no to themselves, take up their cross daily, and follow me." And so going through the Book of Lamentations is going to be our road to Calvary, our sadness, our reflection, and hopefully by the time we get to the end, we will be ready to see the empty tomb. The Book of Lamentations is written by the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah is sometimes referred to as the weeping prophet because he writes a lot of sad stuff. The name Jeremiah means the Lord exalts. And of course, he wrote the book of Jeremiah, and then he wrote 1st and 2nd Kings, and he wrote Lamentations. And if you were to read the book of Jeremiah, it would also be a sad and mournful book. Jeremiah is the looking forward to the destruction of Israel. Lamentations is the looking back at the destruction of Israel. Lamentations is composed of 5 different poems. They were written around the mid-500s before Christ. And it's during this time where the city of Jerusalem is destroyed. They were destroyed by the Babylonians. Most of the leadership, the core of the city, they were either killed or they were hauled back to Babylon. So these poems, they come out of war and vacancy and tears and carnage and mass destruction. The name Lamentations, it's a Hebrew word. It's a very guttural word. It's like a shrug and a loss and kind of a and a letting go and a sigh, like all mixed together. And so what makes Lamentations unique is that it's a sad song. And sometimes in our life, that's what we need. The remedy for us would be a sad song. Sometimes that, the medication is just to sit in your car, pull over by the side of the road, and just turn on a sad song and cry. These are remedies. The great theologian Elton John, he said, if someone else is suffering enough to write it down, when every single word makes sense, then it's easier to have those songs around. The kick inside is in the line that finally gets to you. And it feels so good to hurt so bad and suffer just enough to sing the blues. Turn on those sad songs. And when all hope is gone, tune in and turn them on. Lamentations is unique in that someone took the time to write about heartache and to write about grief. Jeremiah felt that what he was going through, what he was feeling, he thought, this needs to be shared. He looked around and he saw brokenness and he said, I have to get this out there. I bet other people have felt like this. I bet they would benefit from reading about this experience. And I think sometimes when you are experiencing loss, it just helps to know that somebody else has felt it too. So let's start. We're going to try to make it through the first 2 chapters of Lamentations today, and it should probably take us 3 or 4 hours. But you have nothing else to do today, right? I mean, this is it. You got your coffee and you're ready to go, all right? All right, okay. Like I said, Lamentations is 5 poems, and within these 5 poems, we're introduced to 3 different characters, 3 different voices. And this is how it starts, chapter 1, verse 1. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow has she become. She who was great among the nations, she who was a princess among the provinces, has become a slave. So the first person to speak is Jeremiah. And Jeremiah is acting as the narrator. He's the storyteller. He's just reporting, he's just giving you the facts. And what he's doing right now is he's personifying the city as a she. He says, there is this city, Jerusalem, and she is destroyed. And then he offers a few metaphors to describe her. He calls her a widow, he calls her a princess, and he calls her a slave. He gives Jerusalem a gender, and then he ties imagery to her so that you can get this picture of what's going on. And I think sometimes, when we experience loss, to just spell out exactly what happened, we don't do that. We have our own symbols and our own forms of lament. We say things like, I feel like I got punched in the gut, right? Or we say, she stabbed me in the back. Or I feel like the whole world just stopped spinning. Or we say, I saw my whole life flash before my eyes. Or we say, time just seemed to stand still. When you're really hurt, we move from literal descriptions to metaphor. Verse 2. She weeps bitterly in the night, with tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her, and they have become her enemies. Verse 2 is a little telling of Jeremiah's feelings. Why would Jerusalem have many lovers? Because she's a harlot. Jeremiah is saying that she worshiped many gods near the end. Jeremiah says, she used to have many lovers, and now she's lonely. We'll get back to that. Verse 3. Judah has gone into exile because of affliction and hard servitude. She dwells now among the nations, but finds no resting place. Her pursuers have all overtaken her in the midst of her distress. The roads to Zion mourn, for none come to the festival. All her gates are desolate. Her priests groan. Her virgins have been afflicted, and she herself suffers bitterly. And then look at verse 5. Her adversaries have become rulers. Her enemies relax. Certainly the Lord caused her grief because of her many wrong acts. Her children have gone away, captive before the enemy. Jeremiah is giving you a picture of just how bad it is. He says, it's like a mother who had her children torn out of her hands, and now they've been taken away to another place. And then for 9 verses, he just stacks metaphor on metaphor. He says, it's this bad, it's this bad, it's this bad. He's painting this picture of just how awful this scene is. And then halfway through verse 9, we have a new voice, and it's really brief. It's only one line. Verse 9 says, her uncleanliness shows on her clothing. She didn't consider what would happen to her. She's gone down shockingly, and she has no comforter.
Lord,
and then we have a new voice that says,
Lord, look at my suffering. The enemy has definitely triumphed.
Jerusalem speaks for the first time halfway through 9. She says, look, Lord. That's all she says. She says, could somebody see what I'm going through here? That's all we hear from her. And then the narrator continues for a few more verses. And then in verse 11, Jeremiah says, all her people are groaning, seeking bread. They give up their most precious things for food to survive. The narrator says, okay, this is how bad it is. People can't even get food. It's so bad that people are selling everything they have just to get their next meal. They're selling their family treasures. They're selling heirlooms just to get something to eat, just to stay alive for one more day. And now this city speaks again at the end of verse 11, and she says this.
Look, Lord, and consider, for I am despised. Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look around and see. Is there any suffering like my suffering that was inflicted on me, that the Lord brought on me in the day of his fierce anger?
So here's a question. In listening to her voice, what is her most pressing need? I mean, sure, you can think of all the obvious things like, okay, she needs her city back, she needs rebuilding, her children are prisoners in a foreign land. We could say she needs freedom, she needs liberation, and I think all of those are easy. I think all of those are kind of fix-it answers. But what is she asking for? I mean, listen, she says things like,
Lord, look at my suffering. Look and take notice. I am most certainly despised. Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look around and see. Is any suffering like my suffering?
What does she want? And sometimes we think that hurting people, they want to be fixed, right? But the words Jerusalem says, she doesn't say, fix me. She says, look at me, right? She says, acknowledge me. Like, how can you guys walk by and not see me? And I think most of the time, when we experience loss or we experience grief, we don't always need someone to fix it, right? Sometimes we just need someone to hold us and to say, wow, this must be so hard for you. Sometimes we just want to be affirmed. And I think lamenting needs a witness. And that's what Jeremiah is doing. He has a picture of his home, and it's on fire, right? Or he has this picture of his wife and kids who are killed by a drunk driver, and he's holding them up to you, and he's saying, just look at their faces. I don't need you to fix it. I just need you to look at it. And this was a home, people. I mean, people lived here, people loved here, they worshiped here, and now it's ashes. Now this place is a graveyard. The book of Jeremiah is a tombstone. It's a marker that tells people who pass by, hey, there used to be a life here, but now it's all gone. And then now listen to how chapter 2 begins. The narrator speaks and he says, oh no. In anger, my Lord put daughter Zion under a cloud. He threw Israel's glory from heaven down to earth. And on that day of wrath, he didn't consider his own footstool, showing no compassion. My Lord devoured each of Jacob's meadows. In his wrath, he tore down the walled cities of daughter Judah, the kingdom and its officials, and he forced to the ground, shamed. Jeremiah says, okay, but she wasn't an innocent bystander here. Oh no, he says. She had it coming. And then he uses very destructive metaphors. In verse 3, he says, in his burning rage, he cut off each of Israel's horns. In verse 4, he says, he bent his bow. In verse 5, he says, he devoured Israel. And Jeremiah goes on and on. He wrecked his own booth. He rejected his altar. It's the, I didn't want to say I told you so, but I told you so part of the poem. And it goes on for 10 verses. And then something changes. The poem takes a turn. See, up until now, Jeremiah has just been the reporter. He's been cold, he's been detached, and you've seen this on the news probably when you watch TV, right? Somebody's family house has just burned to the ground, and the reporter runs up to the dad and says, Sir, a word? Everything you own has just been horribly burned and destroyed. How do you feel? And you're like, really? How do I feel? Well, I don't know, let me take a guess. You just want to punch those reporters in the face, right? How do you think I feel? Or you're watching the news and they say, tonight at 5, some guy has just been gone to jail for embezzlement. He'll go away to prison for 20 years. His reaction when we get back. His reaction? I can take a guess what his reaction is. So Jeremiah is reporting here in chapter 1 and chapter 2. He's telling you what he sees. And he's trying to be calm and collected. And then, in verse 11, his tone changes. He says, my eyes are worn out from weeping. My stomach is churning. My insides are poured on the ground because the daughter of my people is shattered. Because children and babies are fainting in the city streets. Jeremiah makes it all the way to chapter 2, verse 11. And then, he just can't take it anymore. He sees this woman in brokenness. He sees her children and babies fainting in the streets, and he says, my eyes are worn out from weeping. My stomach is churning. My insides are poured on the ground. Jeremiah is the reporter, and he's standing on the sidelines, and he says, I can't take this anymore. I can't stand idly by. And as the reporter, he just has the camera shut off. He drops his microphone to the ground. He walks across the street, and he throws his arms around this woman. So what's happening?
Lord, look at my suffering. Lord, look and take notice. I am most certainly despised. Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look around and see. Is any suffering like my suffering?
All of this time, Jerusalem has been asking for someone to notice her. And then in chapter 2, verse 11, someone does. And there comes a point when you can only watch somebody cry for so long before you have to do something. You know, if you hear a baby crying and crying, your natural instinct isn't to walk into the baby's room, put a pacifier in their mouth, and turn around and walk out. No, your natural instinct is to go in there and pick the baby up, and you rock the baby to sleep, and the baby goes to sleep before you, right? You watch over them, you stand by them. And I think there's a lost art in coming alongside the life of another person and then to share and to grieve and to lament with that person. And I get it. I mean, why Lamentations? It feels dark. It feels depressing. It's not uplifting. There are certain books of the Bible you just don't preach in church. Well, I don't believe that. All Scripture is God-breathed. All Scripture is useful for teaching. And the lament is something that we as a church, we need to learn. This portion of the church calendar needs to be held up because life isn't always a bed of roses. In Luke chapter 5, Jesus says, healthy people don't need a doctor, but sick people do. And I didn't come to call righteous people, but sinners to change their hearts and lives. And let me tell you, sick people are not happy people. And as a church, we can't always expect that happy people are going to be the people that come through those doors. A hospital waiting room is filled with sadness and hurt and real life. And there are a couple of interesting things here in Lamentations that I just want to point out. And the first is that God never speaks. In this book, God is not one of the characters. He never speaks. This book isn't like Job, where people complain about God, and then he comes in at the end. There isn't one voice that is God's voice. Lamentations is not a self-help book. No fixing takes place. There are no answers. There are no explanations. So if you're waiting for that verse that just says, well, hang on, the Messiah is coming, that verse doesn't exist in this book. So if Lamentations feels weird to us, or if it feels strange to us, I think it's because we're not used to seeing grief in such a raw form. All of our stories have happy endings, right? And I think if the hero dies at the end, if there's no white horse, we get mad. We throw the book down on the ground, or we walk out of the theater and we want our money back. The second thing is that pain is real. Pain is real. And we're not used to it being in our face. As a culture, we ignore death. We ignore pain. And we pretend like it's just somebody else's problem. And the longer we do that, we just create this culture of denial. Right now, 160,000 people die every day. That's roughly 18 billion people a year. What do we do with that? What do we do with death and loss? I mean, well, for one, we try to stop it, right? Our skin and our hair care products, they say age-defying. Like that's even possible. Right now, Americans spend over $10 billion a year on plastic surgery. You and I are getting older, but we can't honestly deal with that fact, so we try to stop it. Another way we try to deal with death and loss is we process it through fantasy. When you go to the grocery store and you're checking out the magazines that sell a cajillion copies, which ones sell the most? Well, the one where the starlet is going through a terrible time, right? She's going through some tough breakup, or they've lost all their money. That's the one you want to buy. You want to read about somebody else's pain and somebody else's loss. The magazine that has the starlet where everything's perfect, you don't care about her story, right? That one doesn't sell. So we live in a culture of denial, and we use these stories to process pain. What do you do with all the feelings and the loss that's inside of you? Well, you pick up a magazine and you read the story about the broken-hearted starlet, or you watch the news about the embezzler who's going to prison, and now your pain doesn't feel so bad. You just read the story and you smile, and it becomes therapy. You think it's a story about them, but in some ways it's also a story about us. And it's not just us, right? Our kids do it too. Our children play video games every day, and what's the primary objective in like 80% of video games? Kill or be killed, right? In video game reality, everybody dies except you. The last couple of years, the most popular movies have been about vampires. Well, what's a vampire? Somebody who lives forever, somebody who never dies. Right now on TV, one of the most popular shows is about zombies. We don't know, as a culture, how to grieve pain and how to process death and how to process loss. So since the pain is real, since loss is real, it has to go somewhere. We have to let it out somehow. So we either try to stop it or we try to live vicariously through it through fantasy. Dr. Judith Herman, who works with trauma and recovery, she says the typical response to atrocity or trauma is to banish it from consciousness. That means our typical response is to forget it, to not even think about it, to suppress it, to hide it, to cover it. And if we don't see it, nobody else will see it either. Families, marriages, institutions, even churches, we create these unwritten rules that say, well, we're not going to talk about it. What's done is done. It's water under the bridge, right? The Book of Lamentations comes along and says, that's not healthy. One pastor says it like this: in tapping into the suffering of another, we can tap into the deep reservoir of our own suffering. In other words, our ability to listen to the pain of another, to sit with them, and to weep with them is directly proportional to the time that you have spent dealing with your own pain. Maybe it's uncomfortable for you to come alongside another person and hold their hand because nobody has come alongside you and held yours. Kathleen O'Connor says, Lamentations names what's wrong, what is out of order in God's world, what keeps human beings from thriving in all their creative potential. Simple acts of lament expose these conditions, name them, open them to grief and anger, and make them visible for remedy. In its complaint, anger, and grief, lamentation protests conditions that prevent human thriving, and this resistance may finally prepare the way for healing. I want to go back to a verse from chapter 1 for just a second before we close. The first line of verse 9, if you notice how the narrator talks about the woman, Lamentations 1:9, he says, her uncleanliness shows on her clothing. She didn't consider what would happen to her. Other translations of the Bible say her filthiness clung to her skirt. Do you know what that is? It's a Hebrew sexual euphemism. Remember, this woman is the personification of Israel. God's people had gone and experimented with other gods. They were unfaithful to Yahweh. And so Jeremiah says, she is taking the walk of shame. Her promiscuity is clinging to her clothes. He says she cheated and she had it coming. But then later, the narrator switches over and moves from a place of judgment to a place of mourning. He says, my eyes are worn out from weeping. My stomach is churning. My insides are poured on the ground. So when Jeremiah is standing at a distance, he can judge. But when he comes up alongside of her, then he says in verse 13, what can I say for you? To what compare you, O daughter of Jerusalem? What can I liken to you that I may comfort you, O virgin daughter of Zion? One of Joanna's favorite movies is Pretty Woman. In 1990, that movie made $463 million. Because that movie has a question in it that I think many people want the answer to. That movie is a modern-day parable for something even that we're speaking about right now. And if you think about it, how does that movie end? Let's watch. Sound on.
Had to be the top floor, right?
It's the best.
All right, I'm coming up. So what happened after he climbed up the tower and rescued her?
She rescues him right back.
Richard Gere drives up with a bouquet, and he rescues her. And remind me, what did Julia Roberts do for a living? She was a prostitute, right? In the movie, she and Richard Gere, they enter into a business relationship, but then as the movie progresses, she becomes something else. As it heads to the finale, he treats her less like a prostitute and more like a woman. She's moving from being a product to being a person. She's moving from being bought and sold to being loved and cherished. And in the end, Richard Gere calls her a princess. See, Pretty Woman asks a very important question that many people today, we want answered. Can a new word be spoken about me? Or am I defined by what I've done? Do my failures haunt me? Can I ever escape my past? Do my sins determine who I am? Can a new word be spoken about me? How do I move from filthy skirt to virgin daughter? Jesus enters into situations of profound pain, and he speaks new and fresh words about people that he comes into contact with. Matthew tells the story about a woman who's been subject to bleeding for 12 years, and this condition has made her unclean. She is an outcast. She is a person who lives on the fringe. And then in Matthew 9, it says, while Jesus was speaking to them, a ruler came and knelt in front of him, saying, my daughter has just died, but come and place your hand on her and she'll live. So Jesus and his disciples got up and went with him. And then a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years came up behind Jesus. This woman, she represents Israel. 12 years, 12 tribes. And there's a story behind the story here. This woman, she is unable to go into the temple because of her conditions. She's unable to approach God. And more than likely, she has been living outside the city. And the Bible says that a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years came up behind Jesus, touched the hem of his clothes, and she thought, if I only touch his robe, I'll be healed. And when Jesus turned and saw her, he said, be encouraged, daughter. Your faith has healed you. What happens? Well, this woman, she reaches out in faith. She touches the hem of Jesus' cloak. And what do you think? Do you think this woman has had contact from another person in 12 years? Has anyone paid any attention to her? Has anyone looked her in the eye? Has anyone held her hand? No. For 12 years, she has sat at the city gates, and she has begged for money, and she has probably called out to people passing by.
Look at my suffering. Look and take notice. I am most certainly despised. Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look around and see. Is any suffering like my suffering?
Jesus feels her touch, and he turns around, and he calls her what? Daughter. We read the story in the Bible. It's probably 4 lines long. You blink, and it's over. But what's happening here is so much bigger that it's almost staggering. Israel is the unclean woman. She's the harlot. She's the adulterer. And it's not until the prince on the white horse can show up that he can speak a new word about her. He calls her daughter, something only a father could do. And the first thing Israel says in the poem, she says, look, Lord. These 2 words, they drive the entire book. All she wants is someone to stop and turn around and notice her and say, I'm a real person. I'm alive. I have feelings. Healing comes when someone comes up alongside another person and says, I see you, daughter. And everyone needs those kinds of words. Everyone needs those kinds of places. Everyone needs a place to lament and to cry. It's not about depression. It's about healing, and it's about freedom. We get uncomfortable when people cry. We don't know what to do. We're thinking in our head, well, how can I fix this? But lament doesn't need fixing. It just needs company. This is why a church is so important, because it's not a clubhouse for the perfect. It's a hospital for the broken. And the unique thing is that you and I, we are both doctor and patient. Over the course of our lives, we'll have the opportunity to minister and to be ministered to. And here at Walden Church, we say that every member is a minister. And what that means is we all take turns being doctor, using our skills and talents to help others and to keep the hospital running. And let me say, I think that's easier. I think it's always easier to minister to somebody else. We like to serve. We like to do things for other people. It's not easy, but it's easier than, I think, allowing somebody else to minister to us. Because we don't want to be a bother. They don't want to know my business. It's too much information. I'll just keep quiet. See, we live in a culture where fine is always the answer. Hey, how are you doing this morning? I'm fine. The reality is, we're not always fine. Some Sundays we sing happy songs about how great God is or how great life is, and inside, I don't feel that way. I don't feel that way on the inside. The worship leader wants me to smile and clap, but inside, I just want to punch somebody. Right? A church has to be a place where tears are just as welcome as praise. We have to be a place that accepts both of them comfortably. Remember, God's voice isn't in Lamentations. And that might make you wonder, okay, why is this book even in the Bible? How can you have a book of the Bible without God or without hope or without the Messiah? Is God still there? Okay, well, of course he is. But sometimes God is silent. And that's the reality of Lamentations. Sometimes he's silent. And the only comfort that you're going to get is going to be from another brother or sister. Sometimes you are the only divine word somebody else will hear. You come up alongside the life of another and you say, I know what you're going through. How terrible this must be for you. I can't imagine how this feels. It's going to be okay. I know we will make it through this. We'll just take each day together. Let me know if there is anything I can do for you. When someone is suffering, we join them by just being there. Never underestimate the power of your presence in the life of another person. Paul writes in Philippians 2, Jesus, who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. Jesus came without power, without godhood, to be a servant, made in the image of a human. Why? To be our example. Jesus came into the waiting room. He got down on one knee, and he began to wash the dirt away, one person at a time. Let's pray.